Hello, I'm Nicole Warrington, and welcome to your Lifebook bonus lesson, Field Notes on Feelings. I'm an artist on Vancouver Island, and my work is very inspired by nature. If you were able to catch my taster session called Nature's Palette, I took you on a little field trip to a place called Seal Bay. It's a park near here that has a beautiful forest that travels down into the ocean, a beautiful beach. And in the taster session, we were working on collecting things from nature and then color matching back at the studio as a way to connect with our nature that's around us and a way to be calm when we're painting and really focusing on one element. I really like simple art activities and ones that help me zoom in on the present moment. Over the years, I've kind of eliminated some of the extra layers to my practice, especially as life has gotten busy. I have 2 young children, and that keeps life pretty busy. So I love thick, juicy layers when I'm doing acrylics and art journaling, but when I don't have the time and space for that, I'm really drawn to simple practices of watercolor and drawing, which is what I've built into today's lesson. Our theme this month is honoring and grounding, and as Tam describes that, it is meeting with compassion that which is alive in us right here and now, spending time with our thoughts and our feelings and our needs compassionately. Grounding to me is about slowing down, tuning in, and paying attention to my body and my emotions. It's about cultivating an awareness, a mindful awareness of what is happening right here and right now. So the grounding elements of this art practice are spending time collecting things in nature, which I find being in nature is a very grounding experience for me, and taking time to observe these nature things that we're going to collect by drawing them. And I find that drawing can be a great process for slowing down, taking a deep breath, and tuning in to what's right in front of us. Making art can be a really grounding experience, and for this practice we are going to be doing watercolor and drawing, which I find watercolor kind of calls us to be very present because you need to pay attention to what's happening with the paint on the page. It moves around and it continues to move on the page a little bit after we've moved on to the next section. So there's these wonderful surprises that happen with watercolor, but we also really need to pay attention to what's happening on the page, and that calls us into the present moment. We're also going to be drawing from observation, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to look very representational exactly like the object, but what's of value in the drawing process from real objects is that taking the time to really tune in and be present with what we're seeing, not what we think we're seeing, not with what we're trying to represent perfectly, but what we actually see, noticing the details and the textures. The drawing and how it turns out is sort of a bonus to the act of doing the drawing. The honoring aspect of this art practice is in observing our feelings, taking note of them, and naming them. And for this part, you may have heard of the phrase name it to tame it. I've learned it through elementary school teaching as well as work with children in different contexts, both my own and at school. And this idea of name it to tame it is that the first element of dealing with our feelings or addressing our feelings and honoring our feelings is to name them. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be matching our feelings and our words with our painting and our drawing. When you think about field journaling, you might think that you need to be at a nature reserve or the top of a mountain, but the principles and elements of mindfulness and observation and field journaling can really be done anywhere. You only need a few elements from nature. So if that's a garden box that's on your sun deck or a local park or your own backyard, you will be able to take those principles from field journaling that I'll show you, as well as elements of practicing mindfulness, and pair those together with whatever nature you can find near you.
Before we begin our lesson, I want to share a few of my journals with you. So I come from a background of art journaling and painting, but in 2018, my sister-in-law introduced me to field journaling. And since this is field journaling on feelings, I thought that I would share with you a little bit of of where I've come from with field journaling. So field journaling is the art of going into the field, into nature, and journaling what we see. This is one of my first spreads that I ever did. I was on a retreat with my sister-in-law, who's a mountain guide and who has taught field journaling at a university in Alaska. And this was my first spread where we did some mark making and recording notes about what we were seeing, and then some drawings at different time lengths of flowers, and a little blind sketch of our leader as well. She also, in this one, taught us how to do some color swatching, which has become part of my journaling process, and something called an event map. And this one I didn't get a chance to finish with the coloring, but as we were hiking, we would stop and make notes on the places that we were observing throughout the hike. And I made little notes about sounds I heard, and the longitude and latitude, and the name of the place where we were, and the date, and other details. This is another little journal, similar moleskin. This one I did when I was doing a solo hike this fall. I recorded some colors from the area that I was in at the lake. I did a little detailed drawing of the lake, a shadow trace. I wrote a little bit about how I was feeling, a little detail of the top of a tree. I recorded some notes about the colors, the paint set that I was using, and some notes about the hike and where it was located, the weather, the temperature, etc. A couple of years ago, I took a field journaling class with a lady named Malia Acker. She's a geography teacher at the University of Victoria, and we built this page over the course of the day of the workshop through writing and journaling processes. And this spread includes some really neat things like color studies, quick drawings, a more sustained painting, details, a sound tapestry, and some poetry, and lots of interesting observations. This is the journal that you may have seen if you watched my taster session. This was from Seal Bay Park, and I had you do a really simple activity, just color mixing from things that you find in nature, and mine were colors on the beach. So while I come from this background of art journaling and painting, I've taken an interest in field journaling. I follow a lot of field journalers on Instagram and online and other places, and I think that there's some neat little aspects of this that we could bring into our art practice. I feel like field journaling is a great match for me because I love being in nature, and I also feel like as my interest in mindfulness has grown, that this is a great mindful practice. So we're going to pull some of these elements into our project today. Let's get started. Here are the supplies you're going to need for today's little project. You'll need a piece of watercolor paper. I'm using Canson XL. This is cold pressed watercolor paper, and mine's 9x12. You can work with a different size. You could even work with a mixed media paper, but something thick enough that you can paint on it. The only thing is, if you're working with a different size paper, you'll have to adjust the measurements slightly, but I'll just give you some guidelines. You don't have to match mine exactly. You'll need a ruler, some drawing materials, a pencil for sketching first, and then you'll need a pen that's a permanent pen. These are Staedtler pigment liners, and I'm using a size 0.3, but if you like a thinner or a heavier look, you could go with a 0.1 or a 0.5, but just make sure it's a permanent pen in case you do some painting over the pen work. You'll need an eraser, like a nice white one, or some kneadable eraser. You'll need some watercolor brushes, only one or two. We're not doing a lot of painting. You can have a flat brush or a round brush, and rag, watercolor paint, of course. I use a tray that I set up from Tube Paints, but you're welcome to use something like a little travel set. I also like to use a hair dryer. This one's a heat gun. You can use a hair dryer to dry it off between the stages. And finally, I've made this just for ease of sketching out my plan. I made a 2-inch little tracer here out of a piece of cardboard. So if you get that measured ahead of time, then we'll be able to use it to trace out our plan. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to draw a grid of little squares on our page. So this is a nice pad, and I can just rip out a page easily. And like I said, mine is 9 by 12. And I want to leave some room at the top because we're going to add some notes with date and location, etc. a little bit later. So I've decided that I'm going to measure down about 2 inches. And I'm going to be creating a grid that is 3 by 3. So I've measured this precisely to get that border at the top so I can save that room. But now I like to build in a little bit of imperfection into my projects so that I don't get too uptight as I go along. So although I'm using a tracer, I'm just going to eyeball it. If you would like to measure it all out perfectly to lay out in a grid that is even, you are welcome to measure that out if that makes you happy and comfortable. But I'm just going to eyeball it here. So I'm going to use my little tracer and create 3 boxes across. Don't worry if they're slightly wobbly because we'll be erasing them. So I'm just going to eyeball how much room I want on either side of them. And it looks like about 1/2 inch on these. They don't need to be perfectly straight. And I'll show you how we're going to do pen work later that'll make them a little bit looser. Now we're ready to paint in our boxes. I'm going to leave it up to you with which colors you would like to use. Anything that you're feeling like this week, listen to your intuition. You can paint a variety of colors in each box, or if you feel like you need some more direction, which I often do when I feel I'm busy and I want to ground myself, I limit my choices. So if you want to limit your choices to help you focus in on colors, a good idea would be to choose just one part of the color wheel. So you could choose an analogous color scheme, it's called. So you could work just in the yellowy greens or yellowy green all the way over to blue, or maybe you want to work in the blue violet, red violet area. So it's up to you. The only thing is to keep the color value light enough that you'll be able to draw on top afterwards. And that's pretty easy to do with watercolor because we do add a lot of water to our paint. But a really, really dark color would be hard to draw on top of when we come to using our pens. So keep that in mind. I really love bluey greens, so I'm probably going to stay in this range, but I might use a variety, maybe add some ochres or burnt sienna is another favorite color these days. The technique that we're going to use for filling in the boxes is wet into wet. So you have probably encountered this already, but if it's new to you, I'm going to wet down a brush, and for this one I like to use a flat brush, but if you don't have a flat watercolor brush, you could use a round one. And what we're going to do is wet down the box before we add the color. Now it'll be hard for you to see this on screen, and even on your own page it can be hard to see. So you can tilt your head to the side and make sure that you have filled in all the way to the edges. And it should have a glistening look to it, but it shouldn't be puddled up, like bubbled up water. So as I turned it, I could see I'd missed a little spot in the center. So I'm just going to wet it down, and then I'm going to drop in wet color. This is how I keep my palette. Some people clean it off every time. I keep it a bit messy. I like to mix some of the colors that are already there and add a little bit of new each time. So I'm coming in with this beautiful color that I really loved in the last year. This is by Daniel Smith, and it's called Amazonite Genuine. And it's a beautiful color, and it has some granulating features to it as well. So this area is wet. While it's still wet, I'm just going to paint in the color. And you can see how it'll spread into the wet area. And this is your little field guide for your feelings. So I encourage you to go with whatever colors are going to make you feel good or represent how you're feeling this week. And you can see sometimes I go over my pencil lines, and that's okay. Like I said, I built in a little bit of imperfection into this, and we're going to be doing pen work on top, and we can clean that up. So you can go with just one color, or you can add in a little variation of that color if you want a more textured background. So I could start with my base color of Amazonite and pull in a little bit of blue. So I've changed that color, oh, that was green. Change that color slightly, and while it's still wet, I can drop in a little bit more. And when you move on to your next color, make sure to really clean off your brush, especially if you're going to change the color. So I think I'll try some of that yellow ochre. Maybe tone it down just a little bit with some violet. I think I forgot to wet that one down first. But that's okay too. You can't always go wet to dry. But I'm going to add a bit more water before I add any more color. I just love the way wet into wet looks when you drop that color in. It spreads out so beautifully. So you can continue on to fill up your grid with similar colors or a different color in every box, and you could repeat the colors if you want, just whatever you're feeling. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with the wet into wet and fill each of the boxes. So now that this is dry, we're ready to create the shadows on our boxes. So we're going to be creating a little drop shadow on the right hand side and underneath the box. And I thought that the shadow will make the boxes pop forward, giving the sort of feeling that they are little specimens. So for this little shadow, you're going to need some smaller brushes, or if you have a larger brush that comes to a nice tip, that will work well too. For our shadow color, I'm going to use a Payne's Gray, which is one of my all-time favorite colors, and I'll really add a lot of water to it to make it a soft shadow color. If you don't have something like Payne's Gray, you can mix up a gray. You could use like a blue with an orange to make a gray, or a violet with a yellow. So when you work with a complementary color, you can mix them to make a gray, or red and green for that matter. So you can play around a little bit on the side of your palette, mixing up a color that you like. And this is where it can be nice to have a little bit of scrap paper nearby. So I often have extra bits that I'm doing color tests on, and it's nice to have something so that you can make sure you've got the color that you want before you commit to this. Okay. I'm going to start with a square brush here. And I already have some Payne's Gray here. And then I'm going to mix some into the corner and add quite a bit of water so it's not too dark a value. And that's still too dark, so I'm going to add a lot of water. You can see what's happening on my palette. Sometimes the other colors start to run into it, and I notice that violet's getting in there. So I can either choose to push the violet to the side, or if I use a little rag, I can create some space so my colors don't start to get mucky. In fact, I might just start again over here in the corner. That's what happens with watercolor sometimes. So I'm coming to the corner of the box here, not quite to the corner, and I'm going to come in here and go as close as I can to the colored box. And same thing, not quite to the corner up here. So if you drop in the shadow kind of quickly, while it's still wet, you have a chance to play with it and soften it to give it the look you like. So I had that bluey gray paint on here. I'm going to rinse off and put it on the rag. So now it's a clean damp brush, and then I can just soften the look of the shadow so that it doesn't have quite such a hard edge along here. Also, if you've put down your shadow and it was a little too dark, you can use the soft damp brush to kind of lift some of that color up.